Trust that you know yourselves, what you can handle, and what you need to support yourself.
So this training is merely an introduction to the full suicide prevention training, which is actually a full day, half a day long. Therefore, we're providing you with just basic information so that you know what to do to support and respond to someone who may be contemplating suicide.
The suicide prevention session is being held to assist all school staff to develop increased knowledge about suicide and to give you some tools to connect someone at increased risk for suicide with the help they need to be safe. This session is required to bring the school district into compliance with LD 609, which is an act to increase suicide prevention education in Maine schools. It was passed by the Maine legislature in April 2013.
So the following presentation will involve a video which is about 40 minutes long from the National Association of Mental Illness, otherwise known as NAMI Maine. There is an icon through the presentation that has a bell sound for discussion points, but for time sensitivity, we are not stopping the video, but we will reflect on some of the information provided in some slides after the video. And then after that, we should have time for any questions if you have any.
The more we know about suicide, the more likely we are to prevent it. The intent of this video is to educate and inform and help someone in need. It provides the basic education required for all Maine school staff under LD 609. Hi, I'm Megan Torgeson from WMTW. True or false? People who die by suicide have often shared their thoughts. True. Most people say something to at least one other person before they act on suicidal thoughts. For youth, this may be a friend or a trusted adult. Number 2, most people show signs that they are thinking about suicide. This is true. We call them warning signs, and they can reveal that someone may be contemplating suicide. Number 3, talking or asking someone about suicide will plant the idea and cause a suicide. That's false. Asking about suicide offers an opportunity for someone to acknowledge the pain that they are feeling. This myth has presented a hurdle for providing suicide prevention education in schools. Nancy Thompson and Grace Eaton have each faced the tragic loss of a child by suicide. They have emerged with a commitment to suicide education and prevention.
Glenn was my oldest son. He was an athlete. He was a runner. He was a skier. He was a top 10 runner his senior year, actually. He was courageous. He was outgoing, lots of friends. And he was also extremely hard on himself, wanted to do his #1 best. He was an overachiever, and he just was, I think, found himself in a really tough situation. This coming year will be the 18th year in December 13th, that we've lost our Glenn to suicide.
Timmy passed away 10 years ago this coming July 24th. He was an amazing kid, very bubbly, outgoing, class clown, comedian, athlete, you name it. When I lost him to suicide, they didn't know what to say, first of all. You know, it's not normal for people to take their own life. But I kept thinking about Timmy and the impact Timmy made in those 18 incredible years he was here on this earth, and all the joy that he brought to so many people. And I knew that I had to do something, and I wasn't afraid to go out and speak about doing something positive in his name, because he was such a positive kid. And just because it was a little blip in his life, he was very impulsive. He was going through some struggles, some mental health issues were emerging, depression at the end of his senior year, and that is something a lot of people don't talk about.
The bill has been passed to be enacted as a mandate.
Standing ovation in the Maine House of Representatives for Nancy Thompson and Grace Eaton.
That day, again, April 25th, I know it was the day, they kept open so that it would go from the House to the Senate.
Right.
And they voted right away.
Yeah.
And it went from there to the governor's office, and he had signed it within 2 hours. He actually met with us afterwards to have a ceremonial signing. It was great, unanimous.
The dedication and hard work of Grace Eaton and Nancy Thompson led to Maine legislation LD 609. It requires Maine schools to provide suicide prevention, education, and training to all school staff. Maine is one of 14 states that mandate suicide prevention training.
If we save one child in every school across the state of Maine, we have saved thousands of kids.
Did you know more Americans die by suicide each year than by homicide? In fact, in 2011, more than twice as many people across the U.S. took their own lives than were murdered. Homicide rates have been falling, while the rate of suicide has increased since 2005. In Maine, suicides were 9 times higher. Suicide crosses all socioeconomic classes and ages. Every 2 weeks, on average, a young person in Maine dies by suicide. Heather Carter is a suicide prevention trainer with the Maine chapter of the National Alliance on Mental Illness. I met with her at the Lithgow Library in Augusta to talk about suicide prevention. I understand that there are certain words maybe you should or should not use when you're referring to suicide. How important is the language?
Around suicide, there are definitely certain terms that are used out in our communities that we really ask people to just be really thoughtful about. One of them is successful suicide, and that usually refers to someone that dies by suicide. And we really don't think of a death by suicide as a success in any way, right? And so we really ask that people just say they died by suicide or died of suicide. Just exactly what happened, not looking at it whether it's successful or not. That's one of the most powerful ones. And on the other side of that is failed attempt. And it's the same reasons, right? If someone attempts suicide and survives, that's actually a success. It gives us another opportunity to intervene on their behalf and help them get the support they need. So we ask that people don't use the term failed attempt. Sometimes when people are struggling with thoughts of suicide and they've attempted, one of the things that they struggle with is feeling like they're a failure, right? And so if we call their attempt a failed attempt, that just once again impresses upon them that they're a failure, that they failed at another thing. We really try not to focus too much on what we call the means, right? The way someone chooses to attempt or attempt suicide or take their lives. What we really want to focus on is the positive side, what I call hope and help, right? There is hope for things to get better, and there is help, support out there. It's really about what can we do so they don't attempt again. That's the key.
How does Maine compare in terms of suicide rate to the rest of the Northeast?
The Northeast in general actually has a lower than average suicide rate. The more rural states actually experience a higher suicide rate than the national average. What we have in common with those rural states is lack of resources, difficulty accessing those resources. In Maine, we have a high gun ownership. It's not about judgment for those that own guns. I grew up in a home with guns. My father is a hunter. If a family has someone in their home that's struggling with thoughts of suicide, just really having a respectful conversation with them about removing the guns from the home while that person is struggling. What we call that is means restriction. If someone's at risk, making our environment as safe as possible is really important.
I sat down with Clinical Director of NAMI Maine, Greg Marley, at Halldale High School to talk about suicide prevention. Do you feel that suicide can be prevented?
The foundation of suicide prevention works on the reality that suicide is more than often prevented, and particularly when you're talking about a young person. Young people, adolescents go through this topsy-turvy time in their life, and if they hit a crisis, and they're thinking about suicide, if they can have support to move through that, research shows if they get the help they need, they very rarely go back to another suicidal crisis.
So when you talk about suicide prevention, what are the signs that someone is either in crisis or suicidal?
There are often risk factors that someone has. There are often warning signs that they show. And what we teach people to do is to look for the changes in the behavior, in the presentation, how someone looks, how they're acting, that shows that they may be struggling. It doesn't mean they're automatically suicidal, but you ask. If you're concerned about someone, you ask about how they're doing, what's going on.
Are there any immediate warning signs that someone may be contemplating taking their life?
For adolescents, some of the most common ones, talking about making plans about suicide, conversations that express hopelessness, that nothing will ever change, that things are horrible. Somebody who is really displaying overwhelming emotion, agitation, anger, fear, the kinds of emotions that drive impulsive behavior. Someone who's writing or talking about suicide and having those emotions that are out of control. They're threatening suicide. They may be seeking the means to end their life. They may be tying up loose ends, saying goodbye to people, leaving a note. They're obviously in distress. And when that occurs, that's the signal you need to take action immediately. You need to get that person help today, right away. And you don't leave them alone while you're getting that help. If someone has those warning signs, they talk about suicide and they run or bolt, call 911. That is grounds to have someone under protective custody to be assessed. Call the main crisis hotline to see what help is available. Get somebody else involved if you're the only one there.
Maine has a statewide crisis hotline, and this number puts a person in touch with a trained crisis worker able to address their immediate needs. It is answered 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Most crisis teams are mobile and will meet anywhere that is safe: school, home, even a coffee shop. You can also call this number for advice when you're worried about somebody. What are some of the warning signs that may not indicate imminent danger?
Well, most of the time, when you see these warning signs, it indicates somebody's in crisis. It doesn't immediately say they're suicidal. And there was a group of professionals that came together, and they came up with a mnemonic that they call "Is the Path Warm?" And each of those stands for a different piece. So the first one is ideation. In suicidal ideation, we call it cardinal warning sign. If that's there, you certainly want to act. You know, if someone is talking about expressing their suicidal thoughts. The second one is the presence of increased excessive substance use and abuse. And substances are used sometime to gain the courage to numb someone to take action. They also lower judgment and increase the likelihood of someone acting in an impulsive manner. So that's the is. The path, the first one, the P, is purposelessness. You know, someone talking about having no reason for being alive. A is anxiety and agitation. And if someone's highly anxious, they're angry, they're agitated, they're restless, again, it drives impulsive action. T is trapped, feeling like you're in a situation, no way out. The worst case would be if you're incarcerated, you're in jail, it's a high-risk time. H is hopelessness, the sense that something is really horrible and it's not likely to improve. For warm, W is withdrawal, particularly for an adolescent, withdrawing from school, withdrawing from groups and friendships with no particular reason, that isolation. A is anger, again, a high-risk time because you can act impulsively through anger, particularly if you're picking a fight or pushing against people. R is recklessness. Reckless behavior across the board. Any behavior that says, I don't care what happens, it doesn't matter if I live or die. Physically reckless, reckless sexuality, reckless substance use. And finally, the M is mood changes. So dramatic changes in mood, ups and downs, that indicate someone's really struggling. Again, the is path warm warning signs invite someone to say, hey, what's going on with you? I'm worried about you.
Some of that is what you might think is typical teenage behavior.
You're right, yeah.
So how do you differentiate someone who may just be a typical teen from someone who may be experiencing a crisis?
If you're looking at someone and that typical teen tends to always be a little angry, tends to always be a little withdrawn, that's not a change in behavior. But if someone changes and is showing some of these warning signs, whether they're a typical teen or not, it's going to invite you to say, wow, in my mind, what's going on with this person? I should ask. It's not assuming they're suicidal, it's asking, wow, I'm worried about you. What's going on today?
Is someone more prone to suicide than maybe somebody else? What are the risk factors if they exist?
There are many of them, and we all carry some. Risk factors don't predict suicide risk, but they show vulnerability. A family history of suicide, family history of substance abuse and mental illness, so some of them come from our family. You can have personal risk factors, mental health concerns, substance abuse, sense of extreme perfectionism and rigidity, anxiety or agitation, impulsivity. And some of them come from our environment, from our social setting as well. If someone is harassed or bullied, that's a risk factor for suicide. Someone who's facing losses out of their control, a youth whose family is chaotic and their parents have broken up, those are risk factors. And some of them are risk factors that we often look at as the cause of a suicide. We call those precipitants or triggers. So if I'm a young man and my girlfriend breaks up with me, that trigger causes me to take action. There's usually other risk factors, there's usually other things going on in my life that might have driven that. One of the risk factors that we need to acknowledge is the presence of some form of emotional trauma or mental illness. For those people who have made a significant suicide attempt, for those people who have died by suicide, up to 90% of them were struggling with some form of diagnosable mental illness. Depression or some type of mood disorder is probably the most common, but also anxiety issues, substance abuse, eating disorders, personality disorders. Those are the other kind of high-risk groups. And those people who are struggling with psychosis, where they're not really addressing reality well, are also high risk, particularly in their younger years. Risk factors are additive, so that the more risk factors you have, the higher the risk.
When you're talking about these risk factors, it leads me to kind of my next question. Is there such thing as a typical or maybe textbook suicidal person?
Suicide is a really, really complex issue, and there's often this overlapping situation of risk factors, warning signs, stresses in someone's life. So there's not a typical suicidal person. It crosses all social, economic groups, it crosses racial groups, it crosses ages. Like we all have risk factors, we hope that everybody has elements in their life that help to build resilience. And protective factors are based on personality, are based on skills, based on associations. So some of the common ones for young people, in fact, the largest one is relationship with caring, supportive adults and people in their life. Who knows me, who cares about me? But the skills around problem solving, managing distressful emotions, doing critical thinking, those are important. Meaning in life, that there is something I'm involved with that's just bigger than me, that gives my life purpose, is a huge protective factor. For young people and for older adults, the presence of pets, something that I have to care for, I have to walk every day, it relies on me, it greets me and slobbers all over my face when I get home, that's very protective. But connection with somebody else is a huge one. And one of the things we stress about protective factors, and one of the things that happens every day in our schools, is that people can build protective factors and strengthen them over time.
Having a protective factor may be, knowing that someone may confront you and ask you that question directly, that someone cares enough to ask you if everything's okay in your life.
And that they see that you're known enough to where they notice the changes. And they do ask, they do say, hey, what's going on with you? Hugely protective.
So to recap, warning signs are the earliest observable signs that indicate the risk of suicide for an individual in the near term. Risk factors are long-standing conditions, stressful events, or situations that may increase the likelihood of a suicide attempt. And protective factors are the personal and social resources that promote resiliency and reduce the potential of suicide and other high-risk behavior.
There's a number of higher risk groups, and young people or even adults who identify themselves as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or questioning their sexuality as well, are at higher risk. And the way we frame it, they're not at risk because of their gender or sexual identity or orientation, but they are at risk because of the way society looks upon that and reacts to it.
Isolation?
For them, absolutely. If you're a young person who realizes they're gay or lesbian and you're in a small conservative town, or you come from a more traditional family and you're afraid to show up, you may not feel even good about yourself initially. How do I fit into this world? So that sense of isolation and the fear of bullying and reaction of other people, harassment, or the reality of it increases at risk. There are protective factors for LGBTQ as well. And a couple of them that are hugely important is a positive school climate where they're accepted for who they are and they're people they can talk to. And absolutely one of the most important protective factors is acceptance from the family, from their social group. A family that even can accept the possibility that my son, my daughter may be gay or lesbian is hugely protective.
A lot of people probably ask the question, if someone does feel alone or feels like they're in crisis, why don't they reach out for help?
Some of the reasons why people don't get help when they need it can just be the fact that their thinking is affected, right? If they're in the middle of depression, it can impact the way they problem solve. That can be a barrier. Other ones are stigma. People don't want to be seen as weak. They don't want people to know that they're struggling in this way. If they're diabetic, they can go right to the doctor and get the help that they need. But when it's a mental health concern, that stigma and that fear and that shame can really be a barrier. For adolescents, one of the barriers is that they go to their peers first. Adolescents go to their peers, they're more trusted, they feel like they understand what they're going through, and that's absolutely true. And because of that, in the suicide prevention field, we have what we call peer-to-peer programs where we train youth themselves how to help their friends, because we recognize that they're the front line of this issue for their age group. The more we openly talk about suicide as an issue, the less stigma there will be and the less shame there will be for those people that are struggling with suicide or have lost someone to suicide. That shame and that stigma is a big barrier between people struggling and getting the support they need.
Suicide is something that is stigmatized. It is a taboo subject. So if I have thoughts of taking my life, I may be afraid to mention them, in part because I don't understand them. I don't know that help's available. I'm afraid to disappoint, upset, or otherwise alienate the people that care about me. For a young person, they're afraid. And if it's a young person who doesn't have good connections with an adult, they may not know who to turn to. That's why sometimes young people turn to their peers if there's not a good helping resource in an adult, either in their family, in the school, and in the community. Anyone can act to prevent a suicide, anyone can act to save a life. And that it really requires all of us to be able to be aware and to be able to be willing to step forward and show concern to end the risk of suicide.
There is a belief that if you mention the word suicide to someone that you're concerned about, that you will plant the idea in their heads. Language is really powerful, but it's not the ultimate power, and this is what I mean by that. So if I see someone struggling and I do the courageous thing and make that connection with them and have this difficult conversation with them, and I ask them directly, which is what we ask people to do, are you considering suicide? Is suicide an option for you right now, right? If I ask them that question, it's not like a light bulb's gonna go off in their head, whereas before that question, they weren't thinking about suicide, but because you mentioned the word, all of a sudden that light bulb's gonna go off and they're gonna be like, oh, well, before I wasn't thinking about suicide, but now that you mention it, yep, now that's gonna be on my list of options. It just doesn't have that much power. Yes, language is powerful, but it's not that powerful. And really what we see is the opposite effect. Being direct in a non-judgmental way and asking someone very clearly if they're considering suicide makes a connection between you and that person. And they feel heard and seen, and hopefully they feel less isolated, right? They see that someone cares about them. No, it does not plant the idea in their head. And the opposite side of that coin is it offers support, really. So it's really more powerful in the other side of the issue than increasing risk for suicide. So we really do ask that people, if you're concerned about someone, you think they're in a mental health crisis, a suicide crisis, that you do ask them.
So the advice is to really be that direct?
Yeah. The key is to not ask a loaded question. So an example of a loaded question would be, you're not thinking about suicide, are you? That's a loaded question. The only answer to that question is no. Right? You've made it clear without saying it that you don't want the answer to be yes. Do we want the answer to be yes? Never do we want the answer to be yes. We don't want anyone to struggle with suicide, but we don't want to lead them in the direction of saying no to that question by the way we ask it. So when we talk about what we call intervention, right, making this connection with someone, having this conversation, what we do is we ask people to be very clear and direct, right? Are you considering suicide? It's courageous to make that connection.
When in the teaching we do, one of the biggest goals we have is making it okay for someone to talk about and ask about suicide. It's that breaking down of isolation between two people, that encouraging conversation and showing that someone that you see them, you know what's going on, you recognize the changes that are happening. What's the issue here? Talk to me.
Think about how you would reach out to somebody you are concerned about. How would you ask them about suicide? How would you assist them getting the help they need? Take the time to think about it. The more you do, the better prepared you'll be should that situation arise. If you get the courage to confront someone and ask them if they are contemplating or thinking about suicide, and you ask them directly and the answer is yes, then what?
If I ask someone that if they're thinking about suicide and they say yes, I'm not going to leave them. I'm going to bring them to that support, whatever that first step is. It could be calling the crisis line. It could be connecting them with the nurse's office. Providers, professionals, we ask that they have a list of resources before they ever think they'll have this conversation, so they're prepared. You have to make sure that trust and that connection's there, right? So the process that we look at is show you care, ask the question, get help. The question being, are you suicidal? Are you considering suicide? Show you care, in my opinion, is the biggest piece, especially if you're working with adolescents. One of the concerns for adolescents is, do they trust the adults? So we need to make sure that we impress upon them that we are trustworthy and that we care about them. And one of the defaults when we want to show someone that we care about them is just to say, I care about you, which is great. And you need to prove that you care about them, right? Actions speak louder than words, right? So why are you worried about the person? Why are you approaching them with this conversation in the first place? So you're talking about risk factors that you're aware of and warning signs. You've noticed changes in their behavior that make you concerned about their safety. And so when you approach this conversation with them, you tell them, this is why I'm worried about you. I noticed that you've been drinking a lot. I noticed that you haven't been coming to school. I noticed that you're not on the basketball team anymore. I thought basketball was so important to you, and the coach came to me and told me that you dropped off the team. Right? These are all the things that made you concerned about them in the first place. So that really needs to be a part of the conversation you have with them. Right? You need to let them know why you're worried about them.
That's interesting. So it's show you care, ask the question, get the help.
Very simple. It's not clinical intervention.
No, it's definitely not rocket science.
No, and purposefully. Right? Anyone can do that intervention. The only barrier between someone making that connection with someone they're worried about and not making that connection, the only barrier is them feeling like they're not up to it, right? They don't feel appropriate for that conversation, up to the task is how we put it usually, and that fear of putting the idea in their heads, right? People need to believe that they can most often prevent suicide, and they need to be able to feel that they can have that conversation. If both of those pieces are in place, anyone can have that conversation, right? It's those show you care, ask the question, get help. It's not about education level. It's not about the letters after your name, right? It's not about how old you are. It's about our own mentality and our belief that we can actually make a difference. People are worried I'm going to make a mistake, I'm going to stumble along the way, I'm not going to use the right language, right? Yes, language is important, but it should never be a barrier. Right? It should never be a barrier between you and making a connection with someone that's struggling. Whether you're an English teacher, a teenager, or even a counselor in a school, they're the bridge between this person and their ongoing support. They're not the end destination, and they should not try to be everything to that person.
A person in crisis will often talk to someone they feel comfortable with, and that person could be you. And that's why we look to bring suicide awareness and prevention to a broad school audience.
With LD 609 in Maine, we're educating all staff. So really, once those staff have that information, they can be seen as a resource. Say I'm struggling with thoughts of suicide and I'm a 16-year-old, and the adult I trust most in my building is the bus driver.
What if I am that trusted adult? What if I am that bus driver, that custodian, maybe somebody who works in the cafeteria? What do I do with the information, and where do I go to help?
Most schools have what we call a crisis team. And those crisis team members will have a deeper education around what to do when someone's struggling with suicide. With this LD 609, with the new law, all the school districts will also have gatekeepers. And they're really the lead for potential suicidal crisis. So those will be resources in those districts once they're all trained.
If you're somebody working in a school system, who do you turn to if you have a student that you might be concerned about? And the first place you turn is, who are your clinical people? Who are the social workers, the counselors, the guidance counselor, the nurses in the school? Who is the school's gatekeepers? Who has had the suicide prevention gatekeeper training? Those are resources that you want to turn to first, because they have the background that can help. If they're not available, absolutely turn to your administrator. There's also a number of resources available in the community and in the state that might be really important in a crisis. The first one is the statewide mental health crisis line, and it's 1-888-568-1112. And calling that number from a landline puts you in touch with the mental health crisis team in your region. And so the phone is likely to be picked up by someone who's got background in training, in suicide and suicide assessment, and they can be a resource to answer questions. They can also be a resource to come and do an assessment of an individual who might be at risk. In addition to that, if someone is perhaps under the influence of substances or out of control, your first resource may be to call 911, because it might be an emergency that requires law enforcement or emergency medical technicians to respond to it. The most important thing is that if you're somebody who hears about someone who might be at risk, if you're talking about suicide, that you don't keep it to yourself. You make sure you connect them with the help they need.
You mentioned that suicide is stigmatized. If sadly it does happen, or an attempted suicide happens inside of a community, how should people handle it and what should they do?
Part of it is, first and foremost, to preserve safety, to make sure that that person gets the help they need. And then to also look who else is impacted by this person's attempt, who else needs support and help. And the support for the person who attempted suicide also includes support for when they come back to the school community. How do they need to be transitioned in to know that they have someone they can turn to for help, without everybody needing to know the whole story, because they do still have a right to privacy. If you are in a community, or if you're in a school community where there has been a suicide, the way that the community responds after that suicide is hugely important in terms of reducing the risk of copycat suicides or contagion. For young people, that's the time of life when contagion reaches its peak. And so after a suicide in a school community, we want to make sure that the school, as much as possible, is thoughtful about how they communicate the news and tell the story. And in today's age, everybody's going to be walking through the doors first thing in the morning because they have those magic boxes we call smartphones. They have a story. It may not be the reality. So how do you let the news out in a controlled way, in small groups, not over the loudspeaker, not in an assembly, but maybe in the homeroom, so you can watch and see how people are reacting. It's important that the school recognize who might be vulnerable, who might be feeling responsible, who's most impacted, and make sure that those people have support. It's important to send some kind of message home to parents and let them know that there has been a death, that if it's been ruled a suicide, that there's been a loss by suicide, and to be aware of the needs of their kids. And maybe a resource about how to talk about the grief of suicide with their kids at different ages. Staff who lose a student to suicide are as deeply impacted as the rest of the students. Make sure they have a place where they can talk about it, they can debrief, they can get the support they need as well.
We've heard a lot of terms. What does suicide survivor mean?
A suicide survivor is someone who is deeply impacted by the death of somebody by suicide. Classically, we think of a family member as a suicide survivor, and absolutely they are included as survivors, but it can also be a close friend, a co-worker, anybody who's deeply impacted.
If you know someone that is a suicide survivor, if there's someone in your community, someone that you care about that you know has been personally impacted by suicide, be there for them.
What a suicide survivor will often tell you, even if it's something that is open, is that people are afraid to mention it. That people will even avoid them, and when they meet them, not bring up the loss. So what anyone can do, first and foremost, if you know that person who has had a suicide loss, acknowledge it. Speak to them, use the name of the person who died, and say, I'm really sorry, I heard about Paul's death. How are you doing? And that kind of opens the door to allow that person to talk or not talk as they wish. So you acknowledge the death, you use the name of the person, you share your presence. None of us can fix the grief of a suicide survivor, but allowing someone to talk to the extent that they are willing gives them space to heal. You encourage support for someone who's a survivor who's really struggling. And if you knew the person who died, share something about their life, the good things. Because someone who dies by suicide is so much more than just their means of death.
Let's talk about NAMI Maine.
Well, NAMI Maine is a grassroots membership organization, and our foundational mission is to provide support, education, and advocacy for people affected by mental illness. And we do that through a series of trained volunteers across the state who help to provide education groups. They provide support groups for family members, support groups for people living with mental illness, support group for veterans. We do a great deal of outreach and education. And then there's some core programming led out of the state office that includes support for those groups, work with law enforcement and corrections officers around crisis intervention, family respite program to provide support for families who have a child under the age of 18 who is diagnosed with a mental illness or a developmental disability. Our suicide prevention division is housed in NAMI, and we also offer mental health first aid education to teach people about mental health and mental illness and what anybody can do to support someone who's living with a mental illness.
For an up-to-date list on grief support groups, call NAMI Maine or call the Information and Resource Center for a Survivors of Suicide kit.
My hopes and dreams are that, if we could save one child, the pain and suffering that Grace and I have gone through, losing our sons. I mean, that's a huge hope and dream. But I know, literally, by speaking out over the last 10 years, that we've saved lots of lives. I think if family members or the school population has an opportunity, maybe that just one more tap on the shoulder to say, I know that Susie or Bobby or Mary is not doing well. Can you just check in? 9 times out of 10, that may save somebody's life.
My legacy will be education. Education for suicide awareness and prevention. And again, that will save lives. And if we can't save them all, we will save some.
Thank you for participating in this training. Remember, you can make a difference, and that difference could be life or death.
It's everywhere, it's in every family, it emerges at different times, and I can't tell you, there's not one family in this country that has not had to deal with a mental health issue. And if I had known, if I'd only known, been educated a little bit more, Timmy, I would have strapped that kid to my back, and I wouldn't have let it go. I would have held him so tight on my shoulder, 6'3", 175 pounds of him, every day. But I didn't know what the end result was.
We know this video is emotional and presented a lot of information. We'd like to take a few minutes to reflect on some of the key information. Please take a moment to review these statistics about suicide in Maine. While all of these statistics are disturbing, we've highlighted a couple that stand out in this slide. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among young people ages 15 to 34. The first leading cause of death for young people is accidents, which is also troubling because sometimes suicides are labeled accidents, so these numbers may actually be higher than we think. Another one is that females are attempting suicide in Maine more often, but more males are dying by suicide because they choose firearms as their method to do so.
So in this slide, we want to show that adolescents are on a roller coaster of emotional turmoil in their lives, emotionally with stress level, and with their lives and their bodies. They are rapidly changing at any given time and may lack the emotional skills and maturity to cope. Other reasons for the emotional turmoil might include that they're impulsive, their stress levels are high, they might be experiencing bullying or harassment, and although adults die by suicide more frequently, the ratio you see here in this slide is that for every one attempt, there's 100 to 200 thinking about it or attempting it.
Above are the most obvious warning signs that someone is contemplating suicide. Some of the more subtle signs may be, but are not limited to, extreme changes in behavior, mood changes, again in extreme levels, giving away prized possessions, and comments such as "no one will miss me if I'm gone," or "life would be better if I wasn't here." Although these behaviors and emotions frequently present themselves in adolescence, these signs may be more intensive if someone was contemplating suicide. Either way, it's necessary to ask, intervene, get the facts, and then seek supports if they're needed.
So as part of LD 609, it has been recommended that school districts develop and implement protocols supporting suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention, which is supporting supporting families and teachers and students after someone has died by suicide. We do have a team currently in place creating a protocol right here in South Portland.
Can we have the house lights on for a second? Thanks. So, if you're a school counselor, raise your hand, please. If you're a social worker, raise your hand. Keep your hands up. If you're a nurse, please raise your hand. Any Sweetser counselors here that can raise their hands? School administrators? Anybody who's had gatekeeper training or any kind of suicide prevention training? First of all, thank you for the work you do. I know that's difficult. These are your supports. Look around you. They're the people who are going to help you out in these kinds of situations. Thank you.
So if you're worried about a person who may be contemplating suicide, then please check in with one of these people who are raising their hand, or anyone listed on this slide above. If you suspect someone is in crisis or aware of contemplating suicide, please consult one of us immediately. Do not wait. Even if you think it's a joke, even if you think, they're just saying it, we don't know for sure. So just please seek out help and support. As they said in the video, show you care, ask for help, and we'll get the support. The people who you saw having their hands raised, we are trained to kind of assess the lethality and the need for other services, and if that person does need services, then we will reach out to the crisis hotline. And we use the 188 number listed there, but we can also use 774-HELP, which it will connect us to that 188 number.
Again, thank you for participating today. We're aware that suicide can be a difficult topic, and that will be available if anybody needs to talk. Feel free to reach out to us by email or to your building supports if you need further assistance or have any questions. There's further training offered by NAMI Maine. You can contact them directly. You could ask Kathy Germani or you could email us. At this point, we'll take any questions if you have any questions. You're going to have to speak up though. Well, okay, no questions. Well, thank you again for coming this morning. We appreciate it.